welcome everybody to the next in the series of the Fine webinars. Michael has kindly agreed to come back today, and today he's going to be talking about rethinking your business model. The feedback from his last webinar was fantastic, actually. Well, the feedback from Michael was fantastic. For me, not so good. A lot of my clients got in contact to say I looked like an extra from Michael Jackson's Thriller video. So I will make my excuses and say that was my first day back from paternity leave, and hopefully I'm looking more human today. I'll let you make your own judgments on that. So as I say, this webinar, I've looked through the slide deck. It's about rethinking your business model and what it's going to mean in a post-corona environment. A lot of the feedback we got said that Michael called out a lot of the fallacies that exist in sales, the kind of the old wisdom of sales in dentistry. And I think you're going to get that today. There was a lot of bad advice kicking around in the dental industry. 10 top tips for sorting out your dental practice. This is how you build a paint by numbers practice. It all wasn't very good. But we could kind of get away with it in the old world because the demand for high value dentistry was so much that it didn't really matter if you weren't very sophisticated in your approach to strategy. So if you think about it in terms of this, we were running a 5-kilometer race in the old world. We could just turn up on Sunday morning, pull our shoes on, no training, no diet, no kind of additional sleep, and run. Everyone gets through it and does okay. Very quickly, it's actually turned into a marathon. So we need to get more sophisticated about how we're thinking about our business. And what Michael's done in this presentation is not just saying, well, get more sophisticated. He's going to walk you through how to think about your business, the questions you should be asking, and actually how to redesign your proposition to fit with your financial model, to mean you can not only survive, but actually thrive in the new world, because it is going to be tougher. If you let me know of any questions that you've got as we go through, we'll do a kind of brief Q&A at the end. But now over to you, Michael. I look forward to seeing it.
Thank you very much, Dan. I hope everyone can hear me okay. So basically, yes, post-corona, rethinking your business model. And really whenever there are external changes that can impact the business, it's going to be a good time to reassess if you need to make any changes. I think this is a perfect opportunity to do it right now. And in this post-corona world, as I say, the way to do it is not to necessarily go forward and look deeper into your business. Sometimes the strategy is to step back and sort of take a helicopter view at the whole thing and get an understanding of where you're at. Now, the American writer H.L. Mencken, one of his sayings that I've always liked is, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. I really love that quote, and really it's almost like a theme for this webinar. In times of uncertainty, we all do want solutions. We want them immediately, and we'd love them to be all simple. But what I'm saying is beware of simple solutions to problems that are complex, because they're probably wrong. And so what we're just going to talk about now is the idea that what's going to change in the next few months. You'll see more and more high unemployment. I don't think anybody will argue with that. We're going to see greater price sensitivity, and we're going to see a lot of online shopping, people basically calling you up, and you'll have those annoying calls about your fees and stuff like that. Now, these are three trends that I don't think anybody would argue with. And I think we've got to respect trends. If you're a business person, look at the big trends. Trends will carry you. If the market's going to be much more price sensitive, maybe you really need to consider how price sensitive the market's going to be and whether it's going to affect you. And I think it will affect dentistry quite a lot. If you were in real estate, and if you made money in real estate, probably the market was going up, but I know how it is. Everyone who makes money in real estate thinks they're a real estate genius. And then if the market goes down, in order to still make money in a down market, let's say in real estate, you have to be more skilled. And it's the same in dentistry. And just as Dan was saying now, for many years, just being a dentist almost guaranteed that you would make money. But I think now, because times are turning, the market's changing, you're going to have to be more aware of the changes, be a bit smarter, be more thoughtful, and don't just make assumptions because of the past that what happened in the past will be the future. Now, I want to just draw your attention to two obvious things. two practice models that are very clear. There's the model that is for practices that are high service models. And what I mean by that is they will do advanced procedures, they may have a niche market, they are dealing typically with less patients because these people are paying more. More attached to it is branding and high relationships and no insurance. And that's what a lot of dentists have been aiming for all over the world. On the other side of it is the low fee model, which is typically a reduced service. Obviously, lower fees is the whole point. There's minimal marketing, not much of a problem getting patients because they're attracted because of the low cost. And typically, these are all sort of insurance, national health type of practices. Now, as we move into this new reality, here's the danger that people do. They have their existing practice, which is a high service practice, but basically you try to deliver the highest service and you start dropping your fees because of these market forces. It mightn't happen overnight. You almost won't notice it, but slowly you'll start to spend longer on patients but charge less, and it can happen like a death by 1,000 cuts. So it's my aim to shine a light on what the risks would be and show you, I think, how to avoid these things. But this is going to become quite common. You're going to see high service practices start to reduce their fees and they become less and less profitable, and now they find themselves into trouble. So the question is, what's your plan? Now, typically, if you go and get some advice, you'll be told you need to decrease your practice expense. That's the most common advice that you're going to get. You may be told to increase your case acceptance. You also might be told to increase your marketing to get more patients, especially the right sort of patients that you want. You may even be told to work faster. And I'm going to be saying that for each of these pieces of advice, my theme of stepping back to get a better understanding, I'm going to point out some of the flaws in each of these pieces of advice and why they are actually obvious flaws. And I think that if you understood the problem, you'll be much in a better place to be able to come up with solutions. So what's your plan? Let's say you decided, okay, things are getting tough. We've got to decrease our practice expense. Now, if you look at your expenses, it looks something like that. Typically in a practice, there'll be profit, there'll be expenses. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. If you ask your accountant, as your profit starts to shrink because of lower patient numbers or because you're dropping your price, you'll be told to cut your expenses. And then they'll say to you, well, you would say, well, which expenses should I cut? And they'll say, well, let's look at what the range should be, because a lot of practice management companies will operate by the idea of management by numbers. They'll say these are the typical salaries that you should have. Now, these vary a bit from country to country, but I'm just putting up sort of the averages that I've seen pretty well around the world. You can see supplies and capital investment and what your rent would be, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever they are, you tend to be told that to look at your expenses and let's start to reduce the expenses. If you think about it, what would most people attack first? And they'd be looking at their salaries to drop those expenses. Now, we're going to talk about that. But stepping back a bit, rather than getting into all these numbers, I'll take this step back and say, what if the numbers are actually meaningless? Should you really be taking any notice of numbers that actually have no meaning whatsoever? Let's just look at this for a moment. Before we go further, I should explain the difference, in case you're not completely clear, between fixed and variable expenses. It's very relevant in dentistry. Now, the fixed expenses are the things that, like your rent or even your salaries, typically, if you had a big month and then you went on vacation, if you compared the two expenses, your rent stayed the same, the salaries are the same, they don't change. They're called your fixed expenses. The variable expenses are the things associated with your productivity. And so let's say your lab fees go down if you are not working, your supplies go down if you're not working. they're variable because they depend upon you being there and doing work. So this little concept is quite important. Let's just go through this a bit further for a minute. Let's say this is a practice and it's doing 400,000. And let's say the expenses are 75%. So if that's the case, you can see that we've got a profit margin of 100 over 400. So that's your profit margin. Now, profit margin's a very important metric that you need to, if you're not looking at it now, you better start looking at it because it's a key measurement. It's a measure of your security. In this case, it's a 25% profit margin. If you only had a 10% profit margin and your business declined by 10%, you'd be out of business. So that's why you've got to look at your profit margin, because that's telling you how safe you are, how much meat there is on the bone here. Now, let's say you now take this practice and you increase the revenue. All your fixed expenses are in this first 400,000. And let's say, for an example, if you were able to add another 400,000 to this model, what happens to your profit margin? If you doubled the revenue, that second 400,000 doesn't have any fixed expenses in it. It only has the variable expenses, which are just the lab and supplies. And if lab and supplies total together about 17%, the rest of it, the 83%, all of that is profit. So when you look at that, this is the important thing I want to show you, that 75% expenses just dropped to 46% on the right-hand side. The combined productivity was 800, but the expenses dropped to 46%, and yet they were 75%. So what happened there is we doubled the revenue, but we more than quadrupled the profit. Because look what happened to the profit. The profit was 100,000, and it just jumped up to 432,000. We didn't do anything to cut a single expense. And in fact, it's quite draconian to try to shave off that much expense on a practice. It would be very difficult to take your 400,000 practice and drop the expenses so radically that they were down to 46%. But if you increase your productivity, your margin becomes much healthier, your profit goes through the roof. And so when you look at the left and right, we've got the 400,000 on the left, the 800,000 on the right. Just have a look at the salaries now. There was 100,000 on team salaries and 100,000 to the left and the right. Team salaries were 25%. And we see all the way going down there that the red numbers all halved. If we look at this again now, the team salary is 100 on both sides, but the expenses were cut in half. And you can see that all the expenses, the percentages dropped and dropped and dropped. So we've gone from 60% expenses to 38.5% expenses, and the profit went from 80 to 453. Does that make sense, I hope? So when we look to the right-hand side, again, we see that there's been, the benchmarks have changed radically because of the changes in revenue. Cutting the expenses based purely on the benchmarks could be an error because the benchmarks are not really stable numbers. They change wildly based on the revenue. So you see the 25% of salaries went to 12.5%, etc. So in that example, the salary wasn't necessarily too high, but the revenue could have been too low. And we did it. We changed the expense ratio without cutting a single expense or reducing a single service. And really, you could be working on the wrong side of the equation. If we take wages and we try to halve them, chances are we're going to really hurt the practice because now we've got a very demotivated practice. And the problem with that is you could have a miserable team, and that could be very costly. So typically when your clients don't come back and you don't know why, but if you've got a team that's almost like in a sense of mutiny and they don't like you, they can undermine your practice quite heavily. So what we just did quickly here was we doubled the income, we quadrupled the profit. 1 and 1 equaled 4 in this case. If you've got your whole team working furiously trying to find the lowest cost of cotton rolls, in this example, this team member's wasting a lot of valuable time. The patients are standing there waiting. They're being ignored because she's on the phone chasing lower prices. She could have been serving and bonding with the patient and growing the practice. And that's the whole point I'm saying here, that it's actually incredibly difficult to make practices profitable by cutting expenses. And it's particularly dangerous if you cut expenses and you hurt the productivity, because really what you should be doing is everything possible to raise the productivity. So for the rest of this little presentation, we're going to talk about the things you can do to raise your productivity. I'll get to that in a moment. What about increasing case acceptance? Typically, that's a metric that people tell dentists they've got to do. And there's a flaw in this metric. So let's just look at this. Let's say we've got a senior clinician and a junior clinician. What's the difference and discrepancy in the productivity? Typically, there's a lot of difference between two clinicians. And by the way, it doesn't have to be senior versus junior. It could have, the senior might have, in this example, I've got the senior doing all this 8 restorations, 2 veneers, orthodontics, deep study, a whole lot of work is the senior clinician has diagnosed. The junior clinician looked at exactly the same patient and diagnosed a fissure seal or a restoration. Now, it could have been the other way around, so don't, not trying to be ageist here, but the point is that the differences in two clinicians typically is their diagnostic ability. And yet, both of them achieved 100% case acceptance. And that's the key point. We're looking at this term case acceptance, but it really means nothing, because the difference in practices in the real world of dentistry is not case acceptance. It's the fact that you've got one person doing more work because of their diagnostic ability. They're diagnosing different things. They're communicating differently. And so it's very easy to get 100% case acceptance. You can do it all day. Just diagnose very little. Diagnose nothing, and you get 100% case acceptance. And the problem is that people try to compare practices and clinicians all over the place by case acceptances as a percentage. And like I say, it doesn't mean anything. It's a silly number. And I think the people who use these numbers don't understand dentistry very well. So what's your plan? What about increasing marketing for your new patients, to get new patients? The problem is, first of all, I think marketing is necessary. I'm not against marketing, but in difficult times, if your metrics are looking a little thin, if your percentage of profit is low and your margins are low, and you start spending more and more, you can very quickly find yourself in deep trouble. So it would be much better if you can find a way to grow your practice without spending a lot of money. If you've got the money and the marketing's working, go for it, do it as much as you can. I would milk it. I would go to the maximum of marketing, providing you can see that it's increasing your practice and that your margin's strong. So that's fine. But today, marketing's starting to look like this on the internet. You've got more and more people jumping on exactly the same bandwagon. Everybody is trying to do it through the internet, and it's not a new idea. It's just becoming more and more expensive. I mean, the whole Google search engine optimization method is incredibly expensive now, because if you're paying per click and stuff like that, and that sort of marketing, it's a big deal. So do it if it works, but be careful of running out of money. So the sort of advice people often will tell dentists is reduce your expenses, increase case acceptance. So reducing expenses, as I say, I would work much more on increasing the profitability and getting better at doing things to grow the practice, because it's very hard to reduce expenses. And if you reduce expenses and it reduces services, you could be really hurting yourself. Increasing case acceptance as a metric, that's my only question about case acceptance. It's a silly metric. It doesn't mean anything. There's other metrics that I will talk about. And doing more marketing is fine, but if it's very expensive and if you're on thin ice already, that's becoming dangerous. So they're the types of things to be aware of, because they're the typical knee-jerk reactions that everybody has. Now, advertising is not the only way to grow. It can be expensive. And what happens when the patient's in the treatment room is a big variable. Patients don't like being talked to into expensive treatment. And so the team needs to be really skilled in these delicate conversations. And I covered some of that in my last webinar. And it is a complex topic, but it's something that everybody can learn. If you want to grow the practice without costing you money, I think communication skills is a huge thing. But the other thing I now want to talk about, which is probably the biggest theme of tonight, tonight for me anyway, and today for you, is team leverage. You can really make a huge difference if you get the team to be doing more things that you are used to having the team do. There's a massive improvement. I mean, let's just look at this. If you've got existing patients and they are being underserviced, and most practices have patients that are quite underserviced, there's a lot more to be done within the patient base than most dentists are doing. I mean, I've been doing this for many years. I used to run these courses I might have mentioned last time, but we would get the practices in. These were all very high performing dentists. And when we looked at the types of patients that they already had finished, there was usually 300% left to do. I know that sounds extreme, but these people were doing things, but the bite wasn't always handled. There were often teeth that were cosmetically still challenged. There were some teeth that were not as strong as they could be. There were orthodontic issues. It goes on. Sleep apnea. And the more skilled you are, the more things you see. So there's a lot of work, you know, in them bare hills type of thing. So there's still a lot of work that are in your existing patients. The question is, can you, uncover that work? If you look at what clinicians do every day, they basically do two things. You treat and you talk. And every team member that will say, you know, the dentist spends a lot of time talking, and often it's hard to shut the dentist up. If you look at what percentage is treatment and what percentage is talking, if you actually measured it with a stopwatch, you'd be surprised to find that around about half the time the dentist is doing things that only a dentist can do, and the other half of the time there's a lot of talking and other things going on. It's talking, but it's other things as well. It could be if you've got a CEREC machine, then you're fiddling around with that thing. So other people can be doing all sorts of things. If you're taking photographs, somebody else could have done that. If you're doing cleans, well, if you had a hygienist, you wouldn't have to do that. There's a ton of things that dentists can do to leverage themselves. And if 50% of the time dentists are spending doing dental things, that means theoretically you could double your income if you increased your internal efficiency. And that's without even the communication skills. If you add communication skills, plus you increase your internal efficiency, now you're making a massive difference. And that's really the answer going forward if you want to do things in a way that are no cost, basically. So let's just take this a little bit further for a minute. If we're looking at trying to increase efficiency, usually working faster just means talking faster or drilling faster. And obviously that's pretty difficult to do. However, when we talk about team leverage, I'm just going to go through these points because this to me is the most important slide of today. You can use new patient coordinators. That means a person that greets the patient, takes them into a room, talks to them, takes photographs, annotates those photographs and knows how to do that. And that's a whole discussion in itself. By the way, there's probably an hour, then one can talk about every topic here. You could have a preemptive approach to insurance. Now, if people have got other types of insurance other than the national health, there's things to discuss there. This is a little less relevant to the UK, perhaps. In treatment discussions with the team, a lot more can be done when the team discusses treatment with patients. If there's impressions to be done, whether it's scans, other people can do those things. If there's hygiene, again, someone else can do it, a hygienist. Pre-blocking times or days, what that really means is, let's say you're doing let's say you were to pre-block your appointment book. If you're not familiar with that concept, it's the idea of templating your days and creating a perfect day for each day as a template, and then filling the appointments into that perfect day. It's working in reverse. Instead of basically putting patients into your book and saying, when would you like to come in? You have specific times based on the treatments that are being done. So if you had a whole morning of big cases, you probably don't need the same amount of team members there. You could therefore have a smaller team, less staff on that day or those times, and that could save you. That's one way of saving money if you were trying to cut down on expenses. By the way, I should also point out, I'm not saying don't reduce your expenses. I'm saying be careful how you do it, because usually when people cut expenses, they cut things that are services, and that's a dangerous thing. Coming back to this topic, so that's pre-blocking days or times can increase your efficiency and reduce the number of team members working at that time. Same with orthodontics particularly. There's ways to be able to reduce your costs if they're all happening at the same time. Patient satisfaction calls by the team instead of the dentist, if you're doing any of that sort of thing. Using multiple rooms more effectively. If you're not doing it, that's a great way to go, but you need to reorganize yourself and get into the head of how to do that well. If you're going to do that, you absolutely will need enough team members. You can't just have one dental nurse and be running from room to room. That just becomes more inefficient. When I practiced, I had 2 receptionists and 2 nurses just for me, and that was my standard. Plus, I had 2 hygienists. So that's another story. But you can be much more effective if you have your right systems worked out. So you need a larger team, but don't be scared of having a larger team as long as you know that you can increase your productivity. Increasing your clinical services can be done. There are other things that you can even become more of a niche practice if you increase your clinical services. There's things that can be done. Channel D is a product that I mentioned that is a company that I've produced videos. We now have Channel D that will be, it's actually now available using Amazon Fire Sticks. And the point about that is you can have these short videos playing in treatment rooms. And if you are going particularly from room to room and you've got videos playing when the patient's lying down above the patient that are specifically designed to create more conversations, plus if you have a team member that can be sitting with the patient, plus because it's got the Fire Stick, you've got a remote control that enables you to pause a video, rewind it, jump ahead. The point is, and there's a longer discussion here, you can be having team members discuss various forms of treatment with patients that not necessarily talk about the patient's treatment, but talk more about things that you do that could be for other people, and that's another way of getting new patients. It's an extremely effective way. Like I say, this is a bigger topic, but I've got to put it up there because it really is quite a useful way of doing things. So your response to COVID-19, you could have sort of a binary choice where you're just going to continue doing whatever model you have, whether you have a high fee model with high service, high relationship and everything on the left, because that may be a model that you're going for. On the other side of it, we've got the low fee model, and we are saying that in this market, there's going to be a move by the patients to be more price sensitive. And you may not want to just simply move across to a low fee model, which is all national health and a whole different style of things. And I can understand that. What I do want to open your mind to is really a hybrid model. So this would be a model whereby you could still, let's say, and I'm not suggesting you do this, by the way, because let's just go back for a minute. I still say you can do both of these choices as you are right now, one or the other. I mentioned right at the beginning, don't just use the high fee model and drop your service and drop your fees because of the price pressure. Because if you are still exactly with the same efficiency and productivity that you had before, except the only variable now is you've dropped your fees and maybe even increased your marketing, but it's not helping you, now you're in trouble. So be careful with that. But if you're going to make some changes, you need to make sort of global changes with the practice and be very clear what you're trying to do. So now coming back to where I was a moment ago, in this hybrid model, let's just say you had lower fees because the market was pushing you that way. And that gave you more patients, and you're doing insurance, which you weren't. But you still had high relationship. How? Because you can use your team to do it. You could still have some niche going on because you could have special work that you do that other people aren't doing. You could still do advanced procedures because you've sort of built this system that depends now entirely on average having a team leverage. And all the things I mentioned underneath that topic of team leverage, that you now learned how to do that really well. And quite honestly, I think everybody should be doing it anyway because it creates more efficiency. Now, dentists will often think, look, I can't have my team do the things that I was doing. They can't talk to the patient. And you're right. Without training, without a whole effort, it won't just happen. You can't just look at that list and say, I'm now going to do that. This requires a whole range of a new thinking. You've got to think about each topic. You've got to know exactly how to do it. You've got to train your team. You've got to measure it, monitor it. Yes, there's work, but it actually doesn't have to cost you much or anything. So this is sweat equity you're putting into your practice now. You can change the dynamics. You can change the productivity of it. You can make yourself much more productive, and yet you haven't taken any risks through the whole process, which is really, I think, the aim of the game here is to stay in business. And maybe you can take your practice to a higher level. I can tell you one thing for sure. When you've got a leveraged team model, your team, if you've done it well, I can promise you will be much happier. They'll be much more fulfilled. Not only that, when you think about it, the whole concept of leverage is it's taking the work off you and giving it to your team members. They are now making you more productive. Now, for any of this to work, you need sort of a system built into it all that is working on its own, so that if the person comes and goes, they can still fit in. Because if you don't have it that way, you're having to train people day and night, you'll never be able to manage. So it does have to be well organized, but it definitely is possible. So the key practice metrics that I mentioned before that I think are valid, one is you look at your monthly revenue. So how many pounds are you making? That's your top line. And secondly, what's your margin? And monitor that every month, particularly if you're doing some exotic things like spending a lot of money on marketing. Just be careful because, as I say, you don't want to you may have doubled your revenue, but if your margin's gone very thin, you're now you're in danger. So they're the two numbers. They're the only two numbers that really matter the most, because a lot of people will say, I need to measure the number of new patients. Not necessarily. You can, but what's that doing for you? You can double the number of new patients and go out of business because there's a whole lot of other variables there. But you won't go out of business if you've got these two bits of information in front of you and you're clear about that. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, what do you measure when it comes to clinicians? If you're a practice and you're trying to measure, don't worry about case acceptance. It's idiotic. Look at hourly rate and reappointment rate. They're the two things. Now, why are they important? Hourly rate is self-evident. If somebody's earning a lot per hour, terrific. That's great. But are they burning patients? Because that can happen too. They can over-service. They can be rough. They can just make a lot of money for a while till all the patients run out. So if the patients are not rebooking, and they're the easy things you can do. You can measure the reappointment rate for every clinician. If patients aren't coming back, that's a worry. So if those two things are in place, they're coming back and it's high hourly rate, you can compare apples with apples. And now those 4 measurements that I mentioned are, I think, gold standard measurements for a practice owner. You'll stay out of trouble if you're using those. Now, you can have 2 practices with identical patients and they can have very different results. And the variables that we're looking at here, for me, the most important ones that I mentioned are the amount of leverage you're able to get, because it means the dentist is doing more dentistry and the team members are handling everything else. And obviously communication skills, which is the big thing for me, because that's where you can get so much more work out of your existing patients. And it's not just getting work out of them, but your communication skills lead to more referrals of the right people. And it's all got to do with what messages are your patients getting when they're there and who's doing the talking. If you're talking all the time, that's making you inefficient. So you've got to learn how to get the team to do that. And again, that's part of the art and the skill. So because of this pandemic, if you end up doing all this, having team leverage, no matter what practice model you have, even the low volume practice model, you can end up with a low stress practice. And at the end of it, this disease, like many sort of black swans, might ultimately lead you to something better in your professional career. So that's I've gone through this fairly quickly. That's the bulk of what I wanted to say. I am putting together an online training program to help practices implement this whole leverage concept, which is something I've been doing for years, and also improve the communications, which has really been the core of my whole career. This can be a multiplier for your profit, because if you can increase your revenue, your profit goes up more than the amount. Like 1 and 1 here leads to 4, not 2. Now, as a final slide, I just want to put up here that, first of all, I hope you had some value. I'm happy to answer questions. As you can see, I've put a link there to an online course that I'm putting together, and it'll give you all the skills to be an expert in these areas. You'll be able to view them and always review them, have your whole team on the same page. And that's the key, is to get the team, into this whole thinking. And all at the moment we're doing is just putting a list together of people who are interested, because I'll probably be doing it in groups. But right now, at the moment, it's going to be a little while before that's up. So if you want to get on the wait list, you're very welcome. The Channel D website, if some people have looked at it, it's being upgraded right now in the middle of this COVID thing. We decided to make some big changes. Right now, the sample videos aren't even working on channeld.com. You see down there, channeld.com. But at the end of this month, a couple of weeks, we're going to have a new website. Everything's going to be there. But if you wanted to, you could subscribe to Channel D. You can try it. It's costing you nothing. For 2 months, you'll pay nothing. After that, if you want to continue, it's monthly. If you don't, that's fine. And during that time, you can really get an understanding of how that works. I created Channel D because the necessity of being able to create a leveraged business model so that the team can have meaningful conversations about various aspects of dentistry. It's nothing like any of the other sites that you might have seen. So anyway, I'm always learning in communications. For me, it's the most fascinating area. I'm constantly learning. I'm enjoying the process, and I wish everybody all the best. If you have questions, very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was great. We haven't actually had any questions, but I think what we'll do is after the last webinar you did, we got a series of questions afterwards. So maybe if you and I arrange a Q&A for next week, and we'll go over some of the questions from the first webinar and any that come in after this.
Very happy to.
Great stuff. Well, thank you again. That was really enlightening. And yeah, that's it. I hope we'll let everyone know when we're speaking next week. Cheers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you again. Bye, guys.